Hello, thank you for carving out time today for the first session of NFF's 12-part financial management webinar series. Just to introduce myself, my name is Christine Alvarez, and I'm a director in NFF's advisory services practice based in the Philadelphia region. As a member of NFF's consulting team since 2005, I work to coach and support organizational leaders across the country in strengthening their financial capacity. I bring the lens of programs from my previous experience working on the program side of nonprofit organizations. And so just wanted to share that I bring that lens of the working reality for nonprofit leaders who are wearing a lot of different hats while attempting to build financial resiliency. Just by way of brief background, if you don't know Nonprofit Finance Fund, for the last 40 years, NFF has been working with organizational leaders in navigating their financial needs through a range of loans and financial consulting services. And even though NFF's founding 40 years ago was literally born out of the goal to provide access to 501c3 organizations who were traditionally and historically shut out and excluded from traditional banking sources, it's really only been within the last 6 years that NFF has begun to more explicitly recognize its own place of power and privilege and its role and responsibility to more intentionally support the aspirations of communities of color who have faced decades of disinvestment because of deeply entrenched and historical institutional barriers. At NFF, we work to help community-centered organizations with a focus on those led by and serving people of color to gain control of the financial resources and knowledge that they need to advance their mission. And we do this by providing loans to nonprofits, providing financial advice and consulting for both organizations and grant makers about the use and the deployment of funds in the sector. And whenever it's possible, we step forward to elevate and lift up for the sector what we're learning about what's working and what's not working in the nonprofit financial system, and what we think we can do to better advocate for the necessary shifts in funding and financing practices so that more money flows with less restriction to community organizations. And we are still on our own journey at NFF as an organization striving to be an anti-racist organization. And in this journey, we are focusing on increasing partnership with Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led and serving organizations, and more intentionally including the voices of those who have been historically and continues to be excluded. And we're honest in this work that we still have a lot of work to do as an organization, and we don't pretend that we've figured it all out. But we're committed to doing the work and respond to the needs of society and the sector, and doing that work led by our core values. And with that, I offer as a starting point for our discussion today, just an acknowledgement of Indigenous territories. Even in this virtual recorded format, we're each joining this conversation from a land, and it's important to acknowledge and face the history of that land and its people, no matter how painful that history may be. And so we take this moment to acknowledge that the land that we inhabit today was stolen from Indigenous community. Today, I join you from the native home of the Lenni Lenape people. Today, Philadelphia, this is land that was unceded and stolen from the Lenni Lenape people. Today's session focuses on the larger systems that our organizations exist and live inside of, and the financial realities that come with that. Those systems exist in the broader context of our nation's history that we hope that by acknowledging helps to widen the scope and the lens beyond this current moment and situate today's conversation as much of a much larger movement towards equity that we as individuals and organizations are part of. And so I invite you to reflect on the Indigenous territory you are joining from. And if you don't know the territory, you can click on the link that's shared here to look it up. You can press pause on the recording. This acknowledgement is only one step, but an important one that starts now. And after this session, we invite you to continue to build on and expand your knowledge and understanding of the land that you reside on as a much longer term process. And so now as we come into this space together, I invite you to take 3 collective breaths together as we move into our session content. So we know, at Nonprofit Finance Fund that it's hard to manage and lead organizations in the nonprofit sector. And before diving directly into financial planning concepts for nonprofits, it is important to begin any conversation about finance with clarity about where that conversation and process is located, to understand the overarching context of the system and the structural dynamics and the real life implications of what it means to operate within a system that was designed to be inequitable, so that we can begin to lift up strategies for not just coping, but navigating. And so our goals for this session is, first, to build a shared awareness about the structurally inequitable system in which we all operate. Two, learn how to build our skills in navigating that system. And three, beginning to unpack and preview core concepts of nonprofit finance and tools that my colleagues will follow on. So today is a precursor to more specific financial tactics and strategies that will be covered in greater detail in the coming sessions. When we think about the nonprofit context and the larger system, it's helpful to first get grounded in our core strengths, acknowledging our strengths and celebrating the great work that is happening and that we do. And this is where they can often feel unseen, because so much about what we read and what we see about the sector focuses primarily on hardship, which is real. And it's important to acknowledge that there are many stories about resilience and strength demonstrated throughout the sector. And just one example, that I want to share is a powerful one that comes straight from Philadelphia in my backyard. So last year, the Wall Street Journal, it shone a light on the examples of community-based organizations who were leaning into the fast developing COVID crisis and stepping up in creative ways under what would seem as impossible circumstances. So one of the organizations highlighted was Treehouse Books. And Treehouse Books is a giving library and literary center in North Philly and provides children access to books and the power of reading through after-school programming. When schools and meal programs closed suddenly in North Philadelphia last March of 2020, Treehouse became one of the few places that neighborhood children could go to get food while other access to services transitioned in the city. And even after this article was printed, there were so many other examples of how Treehouse stepped into the community, providing equity pods, for example, for school-age kids who needed additional teaching support and access to Wi-Fi to just participate in virtual schooling. And among other things, the story highlighted the organization's ability to adapt and pivot quickly, leverage relationships and trust that they had built in community over time in order to respond to the fast changing needs of families in lockdown. So there's so much more to say, and it's been just a really great honor and privilege to be able to work with the Treehouse team. And so yes, hardship and groups on the ground who understand the pulse of what their neighborhoods and families need is important to acknowledge. And so we start here because we start to shift, into the pandemic's impact on the sector. And so in doing that, like just reframing and acknowledging the core strengths of our organizations is, frankly, just an important starting point. And so we want to stay on this thread about leading with strength and resilience. And I'm going to suggest that you take a moment to pause this recording and take a moment, like 1 or 2 minutes, to just briefly reflect on the question, where have you seen resilience within the past year within the sector? And holding on to that, we now turn inward in how we begin to assess our core strengths. Over the past year, we've heard a lot from organizations around the country who want to know, what's the first thing organizational leaders can be doing right now? And for us, assessing your core strengths is where we start, naming the full set of strengths and resources that we bring. And this may seem obvious, but we actually find that this is often a step that gets skipped for all sorts of good reasons too, that there's just simply not time or space to think about strengths in a holistic way. So we're going to do that like right now together. There are a lot of different templates or forms to do this. We find that this particular lens is helpful to help leaders really capture the different strengths that their organization brings to their mission, financial and non-financial strengths, and how those things can help them be adaptable. So certainly, at NFF, our minds typically goes, first to financial strength and using the framework to crystallize just like where we're starting from. But we'll also acknowledge that not all the assets that are key to supporting an organization's mission and community show up as numbers on a financial report. Finance is important, but it is not the only kind of strength or asset that supports an organization's ability to serve its people and do the great work it does. In addition to financial strength, there's relationships and reputation that we leverage in order to do the work in community. Our people and skill sets and talent and data and know-how for delivering on mission. And so we see that many organizations are actually able to achieve mission success despite limitations in financial resources and strength. And so I invite you to begin to do this right now for your organization, and understanding that like how the lack of access may affect where we have strengths. So just as an example, we often work with organizations who may not necessarily have big budgets or big balance sheets. And so on paper, they may not appear to have significant strength. They may not have boards with deep pockets or connections to big funders. But when we look at them through this holistic lens, we can see more clearly how, for example, volunteers contribute thousands of hours of skilled expertise, how relationships that have been forged over the long term in community brings resources and opens doors that would otherwise not be available, and how their ability to learn and iterate on their programs, like through their staff and talent, makes them nimble and effective. So this is a strong organization, regardless of what the numbers say. In addition to spotlighting strengths, this framework also allows us to see where there might be new opportunity, needs, or risks. I'm even thinking about an organization that we're working with right now who wants to identify the need for more cash reserves, for example, so that they could weather delays in city contract payments. For other groups that need a way to capture and analyze their results in community, it's that their strengths in community relationships provides a new and unique opportunity to partner with others. So all organizations are different and will each have strengths and gaps in each in one category and needs in another. And so at this point, we've included this worksheet and invite you to pause this recording yet one more time and take 3 to 5 minutes to reflect on all of your organization's areas of strength, within these categories. We started this discussion about taking stock of where we are and our core strengths. Having reflected and taken stock of your program's key strengths in these areas, we're going to invite you to hang on to this assessment as you move through the rest of this webinar series as a reference and just practical context for relating with the financial management concepts. The companion to the strengths inventory is our framework at NFF for how we think about that one piece, of the strengths model on financial strength. This begins to unpack like how we think about comprehensive financial strength. And we turn to, we turn our attention to the practical steps and tools that we can use to assess our financial position. And that becomes the companion to the strengths framework inventory that you just completed. So when we talk about financial health of our organization, one of the things that you're going to hear us talk about throughout the webinar series is how the starting point is really about our business model, how our organizations both generate our revenue and how does it actually use up its resources. So how do we both make and use money in service of our mission? And do we bring enough in to cover our costs, pay our team? Do we just bring enough to do that? Or do we also generate consistent surpluses so that we can build our balance sheet, kind of like that snapshot of financial strength and position? Within that snapshot, do we have enough cash on hand? And so this is ideally the flow of how our organizations operate. And this idea may not be realistic in this immediate moment, but if it doesn't reflect where we are right now, more importantly is the concept, of what we're aspiring for, as we move our organizations, evolve them and strengthen them over time. And so the last element is one-time investments. If we launch a new program or facility, we may need a one-time infusion of cash that we integrate into the flow of our organization. And so business model is the results of our annual operations day to day. When our business model is healthy, we are generating consistent surpluses over time. And that's different from capital structure, which is a snapshot of overall financial health. Capitalization is about how our balance sheet resources are aligned with the impact we want on the world. And do we have the ability to invest in that mission? And so you will see this visual come up and show up in subsequent sessions as we dig deeper into each of these areas. And so I think just to take a step back as I mentioned, we will be looking more deeply into the specific financial tools and metrics in subsequent sessions. And so today is about locating where all of that budgeting, all that financial planning, where is that located within the broader system? And so to understand the structure and to talk about systemic challenges, we first acknowledge that our sector is plagued with racial inequity in terms of who controls the money flows in the sector and who benefits. Community-based organizations, especially those led by and serving people of color, and larger white-led and white-serving organizations are not operating on the same or level playing field. The system leaves out many, and we know that leaders of color at community-centered organizations, they understand their community's aspirations, they know their challenges, and they have the clearest insight about how to drive change. And yet the research tells us that our current funding system is failing them. Just two examples of data references that we can see is, one comes from 2016 when there was $24 billion in grants deployed. Of that amount, only 10% of that went toward funding communities of color, while 90% went towards funding for white communities. And on the right-hand side, we see stark differences among organizations in the Echoing Green Fellowship that focuses on improving life outcomes for Black men and boys in the United States. For Black-led organizations, resources were significantly less on both revenue and savings. Revenues were 45% less, while unrestricted net worth or net assets were also 91% less than those of white-led organizations. These two data sets, they affirm that organizations that are led by and serving communities of color not only have or lack access to fewer dollars and resources, but they simply just have less control over the flow of dollars as compared to their counterparts. And so why start the conversation here? This could easily be an entire day worth of content on its own, but we start here because the rules of nonprofit finance and how dollars flow that we're about to uncover and unpack, they include funding practices that actually exacerbate the inequities, that you see up on the slide here. And so it's just important to hold these stark realities in our mind as we move into how the actual flows of money function in the sector. And so some of the structural challenges that organizational leaders face can be illustrated by looking at just a simple transaction, that many of us are familiar with. Something as small as buying a cup of coffee, for example, or maybe for you, your beverage of choice may be tea. Me personally, I'm a coffee person. And so as a habitual coffee drinker, perhaps we stay with the cup of coffee. But if I'm the owner of a coffee shop in Philly, I may charge $3 to the payer or the consumer who chooses to buy from me. And so let's just talk about some of the things that are just basic givens, like in the business world, just kind of focusing on this kind of small transaction of what a purchase of cup of coffee, actually means. I, as a for-profit business owner, for that coffee shop, I'm dealing directly with a single payer or a consumer who decides to buy from me. And that buyer, when they make that decision to buy, they themselves assess the value for my cup of coffee, whether it fits within their budget, whether it has the right flavor and boldness. And as a for-profit, another given is that the economics of my business rely on a profit motive, that I am able to set a price that covers the cost, the full cost of doing business, plus some profit. And so profit and overhead, those are things that are viewed as fundamental and necessary, a necessary part of doing business. And that my business model is generating or spinning off some level of surplus with each unit of coffee that I sell. And this visual puts some actual numbers to illustrate this. It may actually only cost me 75 cents to directly make a single cup of coffee when I consider the cost of the coffee beans or the paper cup and the stirs, or even a share of the barista's time. But I get to charge $3 for that single cup because it costs me another $2.23 or so to cover my overhead costs, so those things that can't be tracked necessarily to a single unit of product. So overhead costs might be like marketing and research or other like non-direct costs. And so for all of this to work, there is this kind of underlying trust that occurs between the buyer and me as the small business owner, or at least there's basic trust that the buyer puts in me when he or she hands over the $3. They give me full discretion over how that money is spent. And so it may feel or sound funny to say these rules out loud, but these are all generally part of how money flows in a nonprofit business. What's interesting is when we start to compare how these given money rules, how they just really play out and look different for mission-driven organizations who function in the nonprofit sector. So for one, I, as a nonprofit leader, I'm now dealing with a much more complex transaction. I'm working in a multi-payer system where the end user often does not directly purchase the service or the product of my organization, or at least they don't purchase fully. Oftentimes there are third-party buyers, such as donors and grant makers, who do much of the buying, and they become the ones who assess the value, even if they are not necessarily the end user of my service or product. Two, there's not always, and often there isn't, a profit motive for this work. Mission-driven organizations are often stepping in to meet a gap. They're meeting a social need that has low commercial return. And so we're often not able to set a price that covers the full cost of doing business. And in fact, profits are often perceived as not only unnecessary, but unallowable. I mean, can you imagine showing a funder that your overhead was it 74%, like in that coffee example, of what you actually charged? And so the nonprofit business model, it often requires some level of fundraising in order to cover costs, and certainly in order to generate some level of surplus. And lastly, whereas I, as a coffee shop owner, have full discretion over where money is spent, where I choose to spend money, as a nonprofit leader, if I am raising funds from donors and grant makers, I may have restrictions on where those donors have designated where and how I can spend the money. Donors are often put like restrictions or compelled that their funds be directed towards direct services and not on overhead or general administrative costs. Restrictions also often require a much more financial system for tracking expense categories tied to a specific grant, contract, or donation. And so overall, the way in which money flows into mission-driven organizations, it's multi-layered, it's often misunderstood, which makes our jobs as organizational leaders in making the case for the resources and the dollars that we need much harder. And so we enter in, to this into this conversation because much of what we offer in our financial management curriculum and the remainder of this webinar series is really about how do I get clear on the resources and the support that my organization needs in order to thrive and serve community. And in order to do that, I need to get really clear about just where these limitations exist, and in order to best navigate. And so just know that that's the frame, and the purpose, for why we introduce some of these larger structural and systemic dynamics. As a point of reflection, I'm going to invite you to hit pause on this recording so that you can reflect on, how do these dynamics currently show up for your organization and for the field? And two, how are you already navigating these challenges? What is working well and what is not? And so as we start to move into some of the strategies for navigating the system, and just want to take a moment just to summarize. This is a system in which we all operate. Is not only complicated, but also perpetuates some harmful myths. Myth number one, like nonprofits means no profit. And the truth is that surpluses and profits are not only allowable, but necessary for mission-driven organizations as much as for businesses. Oftentimes, I think when we work with organizations, we spend some time, just like clarifying for boards and leadership teams, and certainly for donors and grant makers, that the term nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. Myth number two, that the overhead ratio measures our value. As we saw in the coffee cup example, in the business or for-profit world, the concept of overhead is commonly accepted as expenses that can't be directly or easily traced to a particular service, product, or cost unit. And yet in the nonprofit world, many of us are required to show the ratio of overhead versus direct services in terms of where we're spending our money, and if we're spending it in a maximum way towards direct services. And so there are many reasons why the overhead ratio is unhelpful, in that it says very little, if nothing, about our actual impact. It doesn't necessarily have any kind of comparable, meaning, from one organization to the next. And it really disincentivizes or discourages transparency, accountability, and can really undermine the effectiveness, or even just discourage fundraising. So for a lot of different reasons, it really moves us away from truth, which is that outcomes is the only real measure of our organization's value, not how much we're spending on overhead. And then myth number three is that nonprofits can be self-sufficient. The truth is that because of the dynamic that we were describing in terms of third-party payers and the need to fundraise in order to cover costs, the truth is that organizations will always need third-party payers, will always need a subsidy form of support. And just to delve into this a little bit more deeply, we can compare for-profit cost of services with customers paying fees that cover the cost. And so, whereas in the for-profit world or that coffee shop, for example, the cost of doing business or providing, a unit of service, that is fully, covered by the fee, or the price that a customer pays. And this dynamic is different, to our work in the nonprofit sectors, that oftentimes our end user or quote unquote customers can't pay out of pocket full or even sometimes a partial fee, and so that leaves us a gap that needs to be met with subsidy revenue. And so what do we mean? I can provide just some examples, but just it's just central to our work in the nonprofit sector, that there are different subsidy businesses that take their own set of capacities to run, and the staff that's best positioned to provide your programs and services, they may not be the ones that are best suited, for example, to write the grants and the necessarily fundraising appeals. And so really thinking about all the different types of subsidy revenues like grants, contributions, even earned income ventures that really one strategy is about like thinking about the resources that are really required to do any of these subsidy businesses well. And when a program or service, when that program grows or changes, it's also important to note that subsidies must also grow in proportion, that we can't grow ourselves out of this dynamic. And so currently we're only able to cover 50% of our costs through fees and earned revenue. If and when we plan to grow, we will likely continue to only raise 50% of our revenue that way. And so it is important just to anticipate during times of change, like how the revenue model will also need, to continue to evolve and be supported. And finally, our sector, for better or for worse, we find a lot of really creative ways to reduce the cost of our services by working overtime through sweat equity or the use of volunteers. And it probably goes without saying, that, although but it's helpful as a reminder that these are cost reduction strategies, that can over the long term have consequences for the mission in terms of burnout, over-reliance on volunteers. And so we name all these dynamics, so that we can be really intentional and clear when we're communicating with funders and with stakeholders, our board, that we can really clarify, kind of like what our organizations need, on both the revenue and the resources, to really sustain these revenue strategies. And so the point, is really about how organizations are navigating the current system. And in many cases, we find that nonprofit leaders are balancing mission and money on a constant and continual basis. They're constantly managing a complex portfolio of activities. And so we offer this as just a way of just clarifying and putting language, to the different types of businesses that we often seeing organizations having to run, or having to manage a portfolio of activities so that they can sustain themselves, on both a mission and a money perspective. And so just to orient you to this 2x2 grid alongside the horizontal axis, this is one way, that we can help, like frame this portfolio. Horizontal axis is mission impact. Vertical axis, we have mission impact, money, and we show these two vertices, just to kind of say that organizations are managing to both dimensions. Ideally, we want to see or strive to have programs that are primarily in this upper right-hand quadrant, where all of our work is highly emissioned, and also provides and generates a lot of surplus or a lot of money or financial return. And we know that in this sector, because we're often filling a market gap or a market flaw, there's not always an obvious financial return to the work that we're doing. And so often, many of the organizations that we work with find a number of their programs falling in this bottom right-hand quadrant, where activities are super mission aligned, but may have a low or negative dollar or money return or contribution. And so as a result, we need to have activities in the upper left-hand quadrant to balance out the money-losing mission-aligned work. And this is where we have high dollar contribution, but no or low mission alignment activities. And that tends to look like our grant writing work, like for example, and data tracking for grant reporting and managing our individual giving programs for the nonprofits, that are, having to engage or comply, with a number of grants. And so this might not be the kind of activities, that inspired you, to work with nonprofit organizations or continue to do the work. But we have these activities in the upper left, because we have to sustain the mission work and support that. And this is what we mean, when we say a mixture of or a portfolio of activities. Just a quick note, we often get questions about the lower left-hand quadrant. And this is where there's a low dollar contributing or low or no mission alignment, kind of activity. And I think that, folks, I think the important thing to mention here is that this typically comes up when there's an opportunity, for us to interrogate activities that might have begun as a legacy program or an activity that at one time was mission aligned, but that as an organization was growing or changing, it no longer was mission aligned or used to generate profit or surplus and doesn't anymore. Sometimes there are emotional attachments to the kind of programs that are in this lower left that are no longer serving the organization. And so, the lower left-hand quadrant is just a reminder that there's always importance in just thinking about where we are as an organization and whether there's a need or opportunity to redesign, or in some cases, even eliminate programs. And so the point of showing this matrix is not to say that there is a right mix of programs or activities, but really just to clarify, make the point that a lot of us as organizational leaders are constantly managing a variety of activities, a complex portfolio of services that fit into a number of these quadrants. And we do that, out of necessity in terms of how we navigate the various dynamics and structural challenges, that I highlighted earlier in the session. And so just to recap, we share all of these dynamics in this session before we even begin to unpack comprehensive financial strength, because we, again, need to know what are the key barriers to building financial strength, how do we identify strategies for navigating, and so just wanted to leave you on this point to say that you will continue to hear from my colleagues, about how to dig in further into the concepts of business model and capital structure as a starting point, for assessing where your organization is. And in the next session, number 2, my colleague Michael Cass will pick up on this concept in terms of providing some metrics and ways of assessing and taking stock of where your organization is. As I mentioned, this is the first of our 12-part series, but you can see that this first half, as I said, is really about providing the fundamentals of financial management and financial concepts. And if you're going to stay with us, for session 2 and picking up there, again, you'll hear from my colleague, Michael Cass, who will continue this conversation. He's going to unpack how we take stock of where your organization stands right now in navigating a changing environment. We'll introduce some financial tools and metrics for quickly assessing your financial position, set priorities, and communicate what your organization needs amidst uncertainty. And so with that, I thank you for your time today.